Also Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, who reported that the offensive had disrupted the pacification effort for the time being, and the pacification advisor, who reported that in his showcase area, pacification does not exist. Further candidates for investigation appear in the Pentagon Papers, for example, General Wheeler, who summarized the situation in the following terms to the President on February 27th, just as Walter Cronkite was speculating about a stalemate, arousing Freedom House ire. The enemy is operating with relative freedom in the countryside, probably recruiting heavily and no doubt infiltrating NVA units and personnel. His recovery is likely to be rapid, his supplies are adequate, and he is trying to maintain the momentum of his winter-spring offensive. Arvin is now in a defensive posture around towns and cities, and there is concern about how well they will bear up under sustained pressure. The initial attack nearly succeeded in a dozen places, and defeat in these places was only averted by the timely reaction of U.S. forces. In short, it was a very near thing. There was no doubt that the RD program, pacification, has suffered a severe setback. To a large extent, the VC now control the countryside. MacV estimates that U.S. forces will be required in a number of places to assist and encourage the Vietnamese army to leave cities and towns and re-enter the country. This is especially true in the Delta. The media reports that Breystrup derides were rarely as pessimistic as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose summary of the situation led the President to order the initiation of a complete and searching reassessment of the entire U.S. strategy and commitment in South Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers analyst reports, the CIA must also be investigated for contributing to the decline of free institutions by its pessimism. A CIA paper of March 1st, presumably uninfluenced by Walter Cronkite, expressed grave doubts about the GVN and Arvin, and predicted that they might cease effective functioning in parts of the country so that virtually the entire burden of the war would fall on U.S. forces. Like Cronkite a few days earlier, they expected no better than a standoff in the coming 10 months. Pentagon Systems Analysis concluded that the offensive appears to have killed the pacification program once and for all, drawing the conclusion that Breystrup falsely attributes to the media, and estimated that our control of the countryside and the defense of the urban areas is now at pre-August 1965 levels. It was because of this serious situation, not perceived American successes as Breystrup intimates, that they recommended what was later to be called Vietnamization. The civilian analysts in the Pentagon must be charged not only with undue pessimism, but also with some of the other crimes of the press. For example, they referred to the famous statement that we are destroying South Vietnam in order to save it. Citation of this statement is the target of much Breystrup scorn. We must also include Colonel Herbert Chandler, on whom Breystrup relies for his comment of the Wheeler-Westmoreland request for additional troops. He was, Breystrup says, the anonymous author of the Pentagon Papers section on this material, and here he described as a startlingly accurate account a New York Times article by Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith, which, Breystrup claims, was a major example of distorted and incomplete reporting. The authors of the epilogue to the Pentagon Papers must also be included in the indictment, given their pessimistic post-Tet assessment of the price for military victory and the illusory nature of claimed progress. The category of people who were not threatening free institutions by the standards of Freedom House is small indeed, a fact that some may find suggestive. It is significant that the major criticism of the media in the Freedom House study is that they were too pessimistic. Strikingly absent is the obvious standard of comparison. The internal reports from the field and analysis by intelligence and official Washington, which were, if anything, even more pessimistic. The logic of the Freedom House brief against the media is highly revealing. In their view, the media in a free society must not only accept without question the principles of the state doctrinal system, as the media did throughout, a fact that Freedom House never addresses and apparently cannot perceive, but must do so with a degree of enthusiasm and optimism that exceeds that of U.S. intelligence, the military command, Johnson's wise men, and other leading figures in the military, political, and corporate world who draw their information from a full range of government sources. It is an interesting conception of a free society. We might ask how the Freedom House conception of a free press and a free society would be applied by Soviet commissars, let us say, to the case of the mass circulation weekly Ogonyok, which published a series of long articles that presented a bleak picture of the war in Afghanistan, depicting it in stark terms, speaking of poor morale and desertion among Afghan units and tough fighting between elite Soviet troops and Afghan guerrillas, and implying that large areas of Afghanistan are under guerrilla control. The articles also give a broad hint that drug use is common among Russian troops in Afghanistan, and they include extracts from a helicopter pilot's journal describing the sight and smell of colleagues' charred bodies, and implying that helicopter losses are high after the receipt of sophisticated Western weaponry by the guerrillas, terrorists who finance themselves by producing drugs for the international market, charges verified by Western observers, incidentally. But it would be inhumane for the USSR simply to withdraw without guarantees for the population, because a Soviet withdrawal would lead to nationwide internecine warfare, as Afghans who are quoted anticipate. The article does not simply mimic standard U.S. media fare, as these excerpts indicate. Thus it describes an attack on Soviet villages by Afghan guerrillas. One can imagine the U.S. reaction had there been a Viet Cong attack on villages in Texas. But by Freedom House standards, it is plain that the editors merit severe censure for their adversarial stance, pessimism, and volatile styles, always with the dark possibility that, if the managers do not themselves take action, then outsiders in the government will seek to apply remedies of their own. And in fact, in January 1988, General Dmitry T. Yakov, the Soviet defense minister, applied Freedom House and Braystrup principles to the adversarial Soviet press, sharply criticizing articles in Ogonyok and Literaturnaya Gazeta for reporting on the Afghan war in ways that undermined public confidence in the Soviet army and played into the hands of the West. In the light of the evidence presented in the Freedom House study, and of much that is ignored, the following conclusions seem reasonable. During the Tet Offensive and its aftermath, media performance was creditable, sometimes very highly so, in a narrow sense. More broadly, this reporting was highly deceptive in that it was framed within the unchallenged and unrecognized doctrines of the state propaganda system, which impose a severe distortion. Media reports compare favorably in accuracy with those available to official Washington at the highest level from internal sources, although they were regularly less alarmist, perhaps because the media tended to give credence to official statements and were unaware of the internal assessments. The reports from the scene led media commentators to draw approximately the same conclusions as Johnson's high-level advisors. The manner in which the media covered the events had little effect on public opinion, except perhaps to enhance its aggressiveness and, of course, to instill ever more deeply the basic and unexamined tenets of the propaganda system. We have now addressed the argument presented by critics of the media for its alleged adversarial stance on their own chosen grounds, the grounds that they select as the strongest for their case. The propaganda model is once again confirmed, thus meeting the most severe test that can be posed. The model is also vindicated by the manner in which Freedom House fulfills its function as a flak machine, attempting to bully the media into a still more thoroughgoing conformity with the propaganda requirements of state policy by methods that are a travesty of honest journalism, let alone scholarship. All, of course, in the interest of freedom. 5.5.3 The Paris Peace Agreements. The Tet Offensive convinced large sectors of elite opinion that the costs of the U.S. effort were too high. Lyndon Johnson stepped down in what was termed by the government a bombing halt and reported as such. The bombers were shifted from North Vietnamese targets to Laos, where the defenseless rural society of scattered villages in the north was demolished, and later Cambodia, where the same was true on an even more horrendous scale. U.S. forces undertook the violent and destructive post-Tet accelerated pacification campaign in the south, and bombing was intensified to step up refugee programs deliberately aimed at depriving the VC of a recruiting base, in accordance with the advice of Pacification Director Robert Comer in April 1967. The Phoenix program was established to destroy the infrastructure of the NLF by terror. The burden of ground fighting was shifted to Vietnamese forces supplied and directed by the United States, and U.S. conscripts were withdrawn, a more typical pattern for colonial wars that essentially duplicated the earlier French effort to reconquer Indochina. And the United States finally agreed to pursue the path of a negotiated settlement, although still not relinquishing the aim of preventing the unification of Vietnam and retaining Indochina apart from North Vietnam within the U.S. global system. This was not the maximal goal the United States had pursued. Thus, in the late 1950s, the U.S. government still hoped for unification of Vietnam under anti-communist leadership, and the U.S. client regime always regarded itself as the government of all of Vietnam. GVN equals Government of Vietnam, and so declared in the first and unamendable article of its constitution. But by the late 1960s, if not before, control over all Indochina apart from North Vietnam was regarded as the maximum goal attainable. As we have heard, opportunities for a peaceful diplomatic settlement had long existed, but they had never been pursued because they were regarded as inconsistent with the essential goal, preservation of an independent South Vietnam that would be a U.S. client state. By October 1972, the negotiators in Paris had reached the essential terms of an agreement, the 9-point plan. President Nixon, however, objected to the terms of the agreement, and the Thieu government in Saigon was completely opposed to them. Nixon's hope was to delay further negotiations until after the November presidential elections, when he would have more leverage. The delay would also permit a vast shipment of arms to the GVN, something that would surely be prohibited by the agreements. In an effort to pressure Nixon to sign the agreements, the DRV made the terms public on October 26th in a radio broadcast. In a Washington press conference, Kissinger stated that the Radio Hanoi broadcast gave, on the whole, a very fair account, then offering the following paraphrase: "As was pointed out by Radio Hanoi, the existing authorities with respect to both internal and external politics would remain in office in the South." Thus, Kissinger sought to insinuate that according to the accurate account on Radio Hanoi, the GVN, the existing authorities, would remain in office as the government of the South and would somehow deal with the other party whose status remained mysterious. But what was pointed out by Radio Hanoi, correctly as Kissinger conceded, was something quite different, namely, that the two present administrations in South Vietnam will remain in existence with their respective domestic and external functions, these being the GVN and the PRG, based upon the NLF. Having reached agreement, these two parties were then to move toward reunification, to be carried out step by step through peaceful means with no external, meaning U.S., interference. The differences are crucial. From its earliest days, the war was fought over the question of whether the South Vietnamese people shall decide themselves the political future of South Vietnam, as the October 9-point plan explicitly stipulated must be the case, or whether the United States would enforce the rule of its client regime, the GVN, as the sole legitimate government in the South, in accordance with Kissinger's version of the